Hello. I hope you all had a great spring break, 2-week break. All Murillo all the time, and then a little bit of a pause, which I think is good for everyone. And now we're back to it. This is the penultimate lecture. Today we'll be talking about Murillo's artistic self-vision, particularly his practice of drawing and his founding of a drawing academy in Seville. And then we will close with a discussion of his self-portraits. And then next week is our last meeting, and we'll be talking about the Murillo craze for collecting works by the artist that hit the 17th, but the 18th, but particularly the 19th centuries. So for 3 weeks, we've been seeing what he can do with a paintbrush, but now for a little while, I'd like to think about what he can do with a pen. Murillo is an absolute virtuoso draftsman, and we have over 100 sheets by the artist that are given to the artist, and I'm sure that there are more out there that are not yet attributed. So this is a really fun opportunity to talk about Spanish drawing, and in particular, I'd like to dispel a recurrent myth, and that is that Spanish old master artists didn't draw. That's an absolute myth, but it's one that's been recurrent in scholarship for decades. It's only, I would say, only in the past couple of decades has been started to be repaired. Everyone knows that artists like Rivera draws, and of course this audience knows that Rivera draws because we had this fabulous exhibition up in the galleries last year. But he's always exceptionalized, because, as you all well know, he spent so much of his career in Italy. And you'll remember this quote, perhaps, from the first meeting. I'm gonna have to project because I can't read it and I don't have a microphone. Apparently microphones are only designed for collared shirts, so I'm gonna keep that in mind next time. So the fact is that foreigners do not want to grant the laurels of fame to any Spaniard unless he has passed through the custom house of Italy. Right, and we know that Murillo never went to Italy, so he is Spanish born and bred, never leaves the peninsula, and he draws. So hopefully that will help bust the myth. And there have been recent exhibitions since, I'm just putting up a list of exhibitions since 2010 on Spanish drawings, and you'll see that the interest is really growing in Spanish drawings beyond Goya and Rivera, who are the two most well-known draftsmen from Spanish, of Spanish artists. But there are many other amazing draftsmen, and especially among them, I would say Murillo is in the top 5 Spanish draftsmen. So there was an exhibition at the Frick called The Spanish Manner. There was one called The Spanish Line at the Courtauld, and then Renaissance to Goya. And you'll notice that some of these titles, especially the ones that are not for exhibitions in Spain, almost have a kind of an exoticizing note to them, which is something that happens a lot with Spain. Spain is a place that people always want to exoticize. And not to say that there isn't anything singular about a Spanish approach to drawing, because there is, but it is kind of interesting the way that these titles are formulated. So there was a show at the British Museum and then at the Prado on Spanish drawings. And then there was one here called The Spanish Gesture in 2014. And then, of course, the Rivera exhibition that was here and also at the Prado. And then most recently, the Carreño de Miranda drawing show that was in Madrid that was actually curated by a Meadows fellow. One of the fellows from Spain that comes here to visit. And I didn't get to see it myself, but I heard it was spectacular. And I've looked at the catalog. So, but indeed, Spanish artists did draw. And this is a drawing by Pacheco, who I'm sure you are all very familiar with. He's the theorist and father-in-law of Velázquez, and he is a very firm believer in in the importance of drawing. But you'll see that his approach to drawing relies a lot more on firm contours, and you see that in his paintings, But when you compare it to works by Murillo, and we'll look at more in depth in a few minutes, you can really see that difference. And Murillo's approach to drawing is much like his approach to painting. There's a fluidity and a vaporousness to it. And some of his drawings are as impressive as his paintings. So Pacheco argued in his work on the art of painting that drawing was the foundation to painting. So why does this myth pervade, even though we know that there are drawings by Spanish masters and we know that the theoretical texts being written in Spain in the period were advocating for the importance of drawing? Well, perhaps because we don't have very many sheets left over from, the top 3 Spanish Baroque artists. Velázquez, I think there's fewer than a dozen works on paper that are given to Velázquez. El Greco didn't leave behind very many drawings, and neither did Zurbarán. So that could be part of it, but also the approach to drawings in Spain. An artist, typically at his death, an artist would have amassed a collection of paintings and drawings. Typically, the drawings would be sold in large groups or lots, and other artists would buy them, and they would be used in the workshop until they basically fell apart because they were so well loved and used and copied and used as inspiration for other works of art that some of them just don't survive. So, but not only was drawing important to Spanish artistic practice, as we will see through the case of Murillo, Seville was an important center. And in fact, the first drawing academy in Spain was founded in Seville in 1660 by none other than Murillo, along with Francisco de Herrera. And this foundation would be fundamental for Murillo's estimation of his own legacy as an artist in Seville. And we'll see that through his self-portrait. And I'm using this print from the 1690s as an illustration. This is not an illustration of Murillo's Sevillian Drawing Academy, but it is the only known illustration of a drawing academy from Spain in the 17th century. And it's from a theoretical text on the art of painting. And you can see here the students are all drawing from this nude model. And then you can also see, and up here, you've got little sculpture of putti and an angel, and this they would draw after sculpture as well as drawing after life. And I think this detail is quite interesting. In Murillo's Drawing Academy, they did rely on artificial light. The Drawing Academy would meet after dark, and that is because when you can use artificial light, you can control the pose, so you could draw the same thing over several days without the light changing. But also, as you might imagine, such a device would really heighten the chiaroscuro effect and allow an artist to really focus in on those contours. So this academy would only last a few years, but it was rather successful because of its modest aims. It was founded as a studio academy with a very simple purpose, which was the exercise of drawing. The artists together all pitched in kind of a member's fee, and they would rent a space at the Mercantile Exchange, and they would meet nightly to draw from life, and then the academicians would supervise these drawing sessions, including Murillo. Unlike earlier attempts elsewhere in Spain to found artistic academies, this one was successful, perhaps because it didn't intend to overthrow the existing guild system, which you can imagine a guild system is very strong and not eager to welcome in change. But this was just intended, the Drawing Academy was intended as a supplemental way to train young artists without supplanting the existing system. So just to give you an idea of what a drawing session, a nightly drawing session in Murillo's academy was like, they would all come in, silence was absolutely mandated. It would last 2 hours with artificial light to emphasize chiaroscuro. Swords, if anyone was carrying a sword, they would have to leave the sword at the door before they come in, I think, to kind of create a more fraternal atmosphere, but possibly also because the sword is a little bit cumbersome if you're trying to draw. And by the way, in the bylaws, all of the members of the academy had to be old Christians and prove their limpieza de sangre, because of course you wouldn't want anyone with impure blood drawing, at least not in Seville in the 17th century. From the lecture 2 weeks ago, you might remember the craze for the Immaculate Conception. Well, we will not escape that today, because every time the artists entered this space, they also had to say a prayer to the Eucharist and to defend the immaculacy of the Virgin's conception. So there's a lot of expression of local identity in this academy. So why was drawing thought to be so important? Well, it was a manifestation for theorists both in Spain but also in Europe in general of the intellectual part of making art. In Spain, you might remember that the status of the artist, you may have heard perhaps particularly in lectures about Velázquez, the status of the artist was under debate in the 17th century. Artists wanted to be considered intellectuals. They wanted painting to be considered a liberal art, but the way society was structured in the 17th century in Spain, there was little difference between someone who would come to your house and make cabinets and an artist like Murillo or Velázquez, which is absolutely absurd to our own 21st century ears, but that's the way it was. So the art of drawing was considered a direct expression of the artist's interior vision and the intellectual capacity of the artist. There wasn't much manual labor involved in drawing. Unlike painting, painting is especially if you're dealing with a huge canvas, there's a very physical aspect of making a painting, and even grinding the colors. And we know that artists like Velázquez were keen to prove that they were not grinding their own colors, that they had assistants in the workshop to do that. They were only there for the very most intellectual component. And for Pacheco, in his theoretical text, drawing is the single faculty that distinguishes artists and artisans. This is, of course, inherited from Italian theorists. And if you've ever taken an art history 102 course, you might be familiar with the paragone, which is a debate. The paragone, there's two in Renaissance art history. One is the debate between the primacy of painting versus sculpture. That is a big debate. We don't have time to talk about that today. And the other is the debate between technique of color or drawing, colore or disegno. And disegno can be translated as design, but also as drawing. And at the risk of oversimplifying, it was mainly the Venetians who were fans of colore, or approaching the canvas with less firm contours and using layers of brush strokes to build up form, versus the Florentine artists who were more in favor of starting with the firm contours and then going from there. But for Vasari, who is the father of art history, and also he's a little bit of a cad, I would say. He creates a model that is not fair to artists who aren't from Florence. But anyway, that's what we're left with, is Vasari. And for him, drawing was the animating principle, this is a quote, of all creative processes. And when we're talking about colore versus disegno, I wanted to bring in the slide that we looked at from the first week. Of course, this painting is upstairs, and then this is a Murillo, and this is a Titian. And this is, I described to you as an illustration of painterly technique, but it also very much illustrates the colore, or the more Venetian school approach to the canvas. And you can contrast that with this from the Sistine ceiling by Michelangelo, of course. And you can just see, you can even make out the firm drawing that is the foundation for this work. And you can see he would work on his compositions very carefully, plan out everything to the last detail, down to the way that the big toe would look before approaching the fresco. And of course, with fresco, you kind of have to, because you're stuck with what you've got once the plaster dries. But I think that this contrast is a good illustration. You can really, the edges almost dissolve in Venetian style painterly painting versus the firm contours of the more disegno oriented technique. But this isn't to say that artists who painted in a more painterly technique didn't draw, because of course they must have drawn, and many of them, we have sheets that survive that prove that they did. But drawing was important to all of the arts, both to painting but also to sculpting and to architecture. And it was thought to be a teachable skill and reflecting the intellect of the artist. So teaching drawing and establishing this important legacy of a drawing academy in Seville was very important for Murillo. So without further ado, let's look at what he could do as a draftsman. There's over 100 sheets, as I mentioned, that survive that are attributed to the artist, and no discussion of Murillo's drawings can exist without Jonathan Brown. He is the foremost scholar on Murillo's drawings, and he published 2 catalogs of his drawings. So if you want to know more about Murillo's drawings, Jonathan Brown is where you would start. He drew both to arrange and invent compositions, but also to perfect his representation of form. And remember, over the past, I've talked a lot about how harmonious and fluid his compositions are, and how graceful his approach to putting together a composition is. And he does it so effortlessly that you almost think he just woke up that way. But in fact, we'll see that he really carefully plans out his compositions. And the reason that his works are so fluid and harmonious is because he is such a careful draftsman. So he often drew in ink over rough chalk underdrawing, as we'll see, and he coaxes works from a loose sketch to a focused study. So in looking at drawings of Murillo, but of any artist in general, it's always a treat, because you can kind of start to see how their mind is working and how their creative process functions. But today I've chosen a selection for the purpose of I've chosen a selection of images mainly because I found good images of these drawings. And when we're looking at drawings, you really have to look at the detail in order to appreciate the technique, and that's so hard to do in photographic reproduction. So I really encourage you, next time there's drawings on display upstairs or nearby, to go spend a lot of time intimately with them. But just to give you an idea of why I've chosen the drawings that I have, it's because I have good images of them. So we saw last week that he does, this is our Immaculate Conception upstairs, and we know that he was working very carefully to put together the composition. But we know that even from his first major commission, he drew to plan out his compositions. And this is from that first major commission for San Francisco el Grande, which was in 1645. And we see already that he's planning out his compositions. And there's almost more grace in his early drawings than there is in his early paintings, which is quite interesting. But now, just to move to more mature works by the artist. This is a sheet in the Morgan Library. I'm sure our former fellow, Edward Payne, is very familiar with this work, since he was a fellow at the Morgan. But it's a preparatory drawing for an altarpiece panel that was done for the Capuchin monastery. But it's also highly refined, and we'll see that when we look closely. We see that he makes subtle changes to the expression of the faces. He's really working out what he wants the final result to look like. we also see that in the face of the Christ child. You'll notice it's almost like it's a pentimento in a painting where you see him subtly changing the position of the lips, the position of the eyes. He's very interested in getting the exact right, sweet, devout expression for the saint's face. And I think that this goes to show in part why his paintings were so successful at stirring the emotions of the viewer and bringing them to devotion. And that is in part because he planned them so carefully. But you can see here he starts with chalk. He starts with black chalk and roughly sketches out what he wants. And then he goes back with ink and a pen to more carefully describe the different forms. And you can see that everywhere he uses different types of lines. Some of them are looser, and then in some cases he kind of lets the pen drag a little bit longer to create more puddling effects of ink. This is also in the Morgan, and it's a line drawing, but it also shows, I think, a mastery of the technique of adding wash. Wash is like what you see here. It's almost more like painting than drawing. So he would start again with the line here, and then you see the way he just. Can you see the squiggle here? You have to look really closely before you get it. But see how my going around the contours of that wash? Can you all see that from where you are? Yes. So that is how he creates this loose and flowing effect. And we remember from his later Immaculate Conceptions that he really starts to nail this vaporous style. And you can see that in his drawings too. And the looseness of the lines that he uses for the moving parts of the composition, like the hair or the Virgin's garments, and then the more focused and studied way that he positions the hands just so. And you can even see that he's revising how he wants, you can see the knuckle here, but then here too. See, I'm having trouble controlling this just perfectly, but you can see the way he's moved the position of the hands. And then you can see that he uses these kind of closely placed lines to create a shadow effect in addition to the wash. So he's really this, I think we'll see as we continue to look at drawings by Murillo, he's a very versatile draftsman. He can draw in a number of different styles, and even when he's planning several canvases for one series, when we look at the preparatory drawings, he'll draw in a different technique for each work that he's planning, which is kind of interesting. This is a much more highly finished drawing. Jonathan Brown calls this a monochromatic painting, and I think when we look closely, we can see what he means. This is not a preparatory drawing. It's a highly refined and highly finished showpiece, essentially. His absolute confidence and virtuosity in the technique of drawing is on full display. And we can see, again, like in the earlier drawings, you see him with this kind of rough black chalk. That's how he begins. So he would start with the clean sheet and begin sketching out the figure in the rough black chalk. And then he comes back with the lines using pen and ink to create a more defined form. And he really then adds the wash to kind of coax out the modeling and coax out the figure. Drawing always seems so simple until you try to do it yourself, or look at an artist who's kind of a second-rate draftsman. And I didn't bring anything like that in today, but when you look at Murillo and then compare him to someone who's not quite as adept at drawing, you can see, you can appreciate even better his capacity as a draftsman. So again, you look at the way he's just sketching out, all of the interest is on the figure here, but then he's using the wash to sort of subtly sketch out the rest of the composition here. So it gives you an idea. It's like a suggestion of space, so you can orient yourself, particularly if you're going to use this for a devotional purpose. And given that it's a very finished drawing, one might imagine that a very discerning and elite collector might be interested in using this almost like a devotional painting. But we know that even in his lifetime, this is a price, by the way, and when you study works on paper, you'll see a lot of times the prices were inscribed directly onto the sheet, sometimes on the recto, sometimes on the verso, and also provenance on drawings and prints is a lot easier to do than paintings. In fact, because a lot of collectors use collector's marks, which are like little stamps, and there's a whole database online if you're interested called from the Lugt Foundation, L-U-G-T, where you can look up what different collector's marks mean. So when you're trying to catalog a drawing in a museum, the first thing you do is look at the back and see the mark and what color ink it's in, and then you can compare it to the database. So it's quite fun to see what different collectors would do, but less glamorous, but equally important to understanding this drawing is the little price that's here. It's 400 reales. And a normal drawing, just to give you a sense of how expensive that is, a normal drawing in the period would have been more something like 20 or 40, between 20 and 40 reales. So this is like 10 times more than the highest price for a drawing. And you can see why. There's nothing rough about it. He's showing off, I think. He's showing off what he can do with a pen and with just monochrome. And we remember that Murillo was so highly prized in his lifetime for his skill with color. But it's not the color in the end. He is a master of color, but it's not the color in the end that makes his work so successful. He doesn't even need it, as we see here. And here I've brought this example from the Met because I think it shows how amazing he was at using wash. There's a lot more wash at work in this drawing. And you can see the way he just perfectly applies the wash to create the forms and contours to describe the foreshortening of this angel. And this is related but is not a preparatory drawing for, because you can see they're not quite the same, but it's related to a work in Houston, which you might all know, that's on obsidian, which is one of his most interesting, what are called cabinet pictures, the small scale works. We've got one upstairs on copper, but he was known to paint a few of these small scale devotional works on unusual surfaces. We also see him working in red and black chalk. And this is a drawing from Princeton that is a preparatory drawing for this work now in Munich. And you can see he would work very carefully to just exactly plan the facial expression of the main figures in the composition, and then sometimes he would even pull out one feature like this ear when he really wanted to get it exactly right, which is kind of interesting. You don't think of an ear as the first thing that an artist would be concerned with perfecting, but Murillo was an absolute perfectionist. We also see this work of St. Francis of Paula, now in the British Museum. It's also a red and black chalk drawing, but this is more of a finished piece. You can see when you contrast, this is clearly something that he's working with in the studio, that he's using to plan his composition. This, even though it is in preparation for this canvas now in the Getty, it stands on its own. And I think you can see why when you compare it to the drawing from Princeton of the face and the ear. He's able to add life and emotion to the figure, even just using two colors of chalk. You can also see the way he uses the different edges of the chalk. If you've ever worked in chalk before, or even with a crayon, you know you can either use the pointed tip or the blunt edge, and he's using more the blunted part to create these shadows here, but then you can see when he's trying to create more of a line, he's relying more on the pointed end. And it's fascinating the way, even with a medium that's kind of messy, chalk is kind of messy, he's able to create these very finely described details of expression. And I think in this case, the drawing is almost more interesting from a devotional perspective than the painting that's in the Getty. If you think about what's going on here, this saint is having a vision. In this, we can see the vision. The artist is trying to portray the vision for us, but in this drawing, we can't see what he sees. We have to use our mind's eye to imagine what the saint might have seen. And there's something, I think, more powerful in the concise approach of the drawing that we don't get in the painting. And then later, if we look at his late drawings, he starts to kind of lose patience, I think, with the medium of drawing. And most of his later drawings are described as frantic, almost agitated. There's just such a force of creativity and energy that goes into a drawing like this. It's almost as if his hand can't keep up with the inspiration that's coming out of his mind. And it's completely loose and yet precise. You can see each line there serves a purpose, even though you can imagine he would have sketched it out very quickly. But he's very deft with his application of the ink. And there's this energy to the composition and yet a stillness to the face. And you can, again, here appreciate how he's applying lines in different ways to create different effects when you look very closely. The way he lets the ink pool and puddle to create shadows, and also to lend a weight to the bottom half of the drawing, and then uses less of pooling where he wants the highlights. Just a suggestion of the contours. He doesn't even finish the edges of the figure. He lets your mind and your eye provide what's necessary. And you can also see that this is clearly a preparatory drawing for a portrait, although we don't have the portrait. There's one that's kind of similar, but nothing that's exactly right. So perhaps that will be discovered someday. But in the meantime, we can see that he's just sketching out in the briefest and most concise way possible the other elements that would be necessary for a portrait, which is this column and this swaggy curtain. You can imagine what the final result would have been. This is the one I want to close our discussion of his drawings with, because it's my absolute favorite drawing by Murillo. It's more controlled than the standing man we just saw, but it's also from an earlier period, and I think it's incredibly arresting. This is Saint Michael. There's absolute energy and confidence, but yet a lot more precision than what we saw in the portrait drawing of the man holding the hat. His entire, it's almost like you can feel the energy radiating off of the angel, that he would take flight at any moment and go into battle. And yet there's a stillness that he achieves in his face. And you could see this kind of loose but also dense cross-hatching that he uses, these more straight lines and then contrasted with the more looping, curving lines. And it's just, Murillo is just such an incredible draftsman. It's amazing when you think someone who can paint so well can also create the same effects with a pen. As I hope you can see just from this taste, 17th century Spanish drawings is a fascinating subject that needs a lot more study. And I hope the interest in drawings of the Meadows continues. And my favorite Baroque drawing here I've put up on the screen, and it's not yet attributed, but I think it's ripe for further research. Maybe next time there's a fellow, wouldn't it be fun to hunt down? There's a lot of this. Spotting on the drawing is called foxing, so sometimes it's hard when there's a lot of foxing to see past the wear and tear and age of the drawing and into the skill behind it. This is not as skillful as Murillo, I would say, but it is still quite interesting. And I think you can date it to the time of Philip IV based on fashion, where they've got these little golilla collars rather than the huge ruffs of Philip III. And you can also tell, some of you who are docents might recognize this dagger cross. Anyone? Santiago, right? Like our Knight of Santiago, that's the symbol of Santiago, the Order of Santiago. And I think that this guy bears a striking resemblance to Miguel Cid, who is the author of that little rhyme that we talked about 2 weeks ago, where they would bribe the children to sing the rhyme in favor of the Immaculate Conception. So it would make sense that if this is a preparatory drawing for a painting, that maybe heroes of the Immaculate Conception, of the Immaculate Cause, would be highlighted here. So I'm not sure how much research has been done on this, but I think it's a very fascinating work. So to move now, to shift directions a little bit, but still with the same theme, we're going to look at his self-portraits. And both self-portraits were recently featured in an exhibition at the Frick in New York that is now in London at the National Gallery, because both institutions hold a self-portrait by Murillo. And the one on the left is at the Frick. It actually only entered into the Frick's collection, I think, in 2014. It was always in Mr. Frick's collection, but it stayed in the family until they decided to donate it to the museum. So it's a relatively new acquisition, even if it's been in family hands for a long time. And then this one is at the National Gallery, London. And this portrait, both are very famous and were very famous in Murillo's lifetime. But this one is like if Helen of Troy's beauty was the face that launched 1,000 ships, this is the painting that launched 1,000 self-portraits, I would say. And we'll see that in a little bit. We see in both of them, he frames his own image in this fictive stonework. And we see that in other portraits by the artist, but he does interesting things in his self-portraits that he does not do in his portraits of other individuals. And by the way, this portrait here was one of the most exciting discoveries in old master paintings last year. Did any of you see the coverage for this? Yes, it was thought to be a copy after Murillo, after a lost original, but because I think it was hung up on a staircase in kind of gloomy place in the United Kingdom. But once they got it off the wall and brought it out, they realized it was an original Murillo, and his portraits are very rare, so it's quite the discovery, and I wouldn't be surprised if it goes on the market sometime in the near future. But it was brought to the Frick for the exhibition organized there, and in the catalog, it's actually still attributed as a copy because they didn't get to see it before the catalog went to press, which is kind of the interesting, the discoveries that a curator makes when preparing for an exhibition sometimes go beyond the deadline for the publications. So anyway, so now we're going back to his first self-portrait. This is his earlier self-portrait, and you can see here he's trying to portray himself as a gentleman. And you might imagine that in 17th century Spain, like I mentioned earlier, artists are fighting for their status, and portraying himself as a gentleman with no signs of the tools of his trade is an interesting way to do that. You can see, unlike in these portraits, he uses this interesting trompe-l'oeil effect where he's got this stone that his portrait is encased in at an angle, and it's this ruined stone. You almost get the sense that you're looking at a slab that has a painting on it, and then you realize that your eye has been fooled and that the whole thing is just a painting. And that's trompe-l'oeil is an effect that Murillo masters, but it's also It plays into this dialectic between engaño and desengaño, and we'll be talking about that more in a little bit, but that, for those of you who don't know Spanish, that's deceit and then the discovery of the deceit or undeceit. And it's a very recurrent theme both in literature but also in art in 17th century Spain. This self-portrait, this is dated in the 50s. So this, we see Murillo is 20 years older and 20 years wiser when he paints this self-portrait. At this point, he's the preeminent painter in Seville. He has nothing to prove. His legacy has been long established. And we'll note, he's not afraid of aging either. You can see the gray in his eyebrows and his mustache. You even see a few gray whiskers on his chin, and just beginning to creep in around his scalp. And his hair, I think, is also interesting. It's a little less ordered and glamorous than it was in the Frick self-portrait. But we know from the inscription at the bottom that he painted this portrait at the request of his children. And you might remember that he had 9 children. At this point, only 5 were left, and he would lose more over the years. He had lost his wife at this point, too. So at this point, he's like this single dad raising adolescent children, and has painted this picture at their request. Now, this might be a little bit of a contrived inscription, but it is quite interesting to think about this portrait in those intimate terms and think this is how he wants to be remembered by those who know him best, rather than his public-facing self-portrait, which we saw at the Frick. But the most fascinating part of this portrait is the trompe-l'oeil hand. All of a sudden, you look at the portrait and you think this is very beautifully painted, but then when you look closely and you discover the trick, it's quite arresting, particularly in person, and particularly you can imagine for a 17th century viewer. This is a convention that we see in Dutch portraits, but not as much in Baroque Spain. So again, like Murillo's genre scenes, we can imagine that he's had access to Dutch and Flemish art, both through prints, but also through the very significant collections in the foreign merchants' homes that he would have been given access to. We see also, unlike in the Frick portrait here, he's chosen to highlight his role as an artist, and we see this selection of brushes and the palette with these colors. And if you look closely, you'll notice that the colors on the palette are the same colors that are used to paint the actual painting. So that's another way he's almost tricking you. First the hand, and then is this the palette that he used, or is it a representation? It's meant to be delightful in its deceit. But more importantly for our discussion today, with Murillo's foundation of the Drawing Academy in 1660, and then, of course, his own practice of drawing, for him, equal weight, let me go back to equal weight is given to drawing and painting. So he considered himself a draftsman and a painter, which I think is an extremely important statement by the artist. And we can see here he's got a compass, he's got a drawing here. You can see there's a foot and a leg. So this is a curled up drawing of a nude, maybe inspired by one of the live drawing sessions that would have been organized as part of his drawing academy. And we see this chalk holder with a little piece of red chalk. And his straight edge there. So this portrait, like I said, was very famous, even immediately after his death. This is the same year he died, and this is a Northern European artist who is disseminating this image, although I think it's strange that he chose not to include the hand, which is, of course, the best part of the portrait. But anyway, artistic license, I suppose. Let's see. And as I said, it launched 1,000 other self-portraits, and we can even see, I think this is the best named portrait in the history of art, the painter and his pug. It kind of also reminds me of our girl with a dog and a donut upstairs. But this is, of course, Hogarth, right? The very famous British satirical painter and printmaker. And he was quite inspired by Murillo. And you even see this interplay between his garment almost fading into this swathed drapery. So, and you can see the edges of the canvas as if it's propped up, but then it disappears here. It's meant to deceive you in the same way that the Murillo self-portrait does. Although I think it's a little less, it's in a very Hogarthian way, right? It's it's a more fun take on the trompe-l'oeil self-portrait. And just to close, I want to talk about Murillo as an artist, again, who is interested in this dialectic between engaño and desengaño. Because painting, a very successful painting, is one that will fool you, right? And this goes back, I think we talked about this in the first week, although we went fast, so you might not have caught it. This is a conceit that goes back to antiquity, even to Pliny. You'll remember perhaps the myth of the grapes painted by Zeuxis that the birds try to eat. So a painting that's truly successful can even fool nature. And then there was a Murillo portrait in the Cathedral of Seville that Palomino describes has a little dog, and that real dogs would go up to it and try to bark at the dog, which again is completely contrived, but it is this kind of debate that Murillo is interested in. Like with his portraits, he tricks us into thinking that he is coming out of the frame, or that the stone is a real object there placed in front of us. And we, as the viewers, catch the deception, but at that point it's too late because we've already been deceived. So we've been victims of the engaño, and then we've interacted with the work in a way of our desengaño. And I think that Murillo, as I've mentioned many times over the past few weeks, is an artist who's underestimated in a lot of ways as nothing but a sweet painter of beautiful virgins and little winged cherubs with chubby cheeks. But I hope that we all can agree that he's an artist who's much more complex than any of those attempts to simplify him. And I think that even upstairs, our own Jacob painting can be thought about. I had never thought about it this way until I started preparing for this series, but I think that we could think about the Jacob painting and even the rest of the works in that series as an engagement with this debate of engaño and desengaño. So this is just very nebulous, so you're going to just have to I have no documentary evidence to prove this besides the paintings, but since this is a fun lecture series, we're going to have a little fun together before we finish. So to give you an idea of what I mean, our painting in particular, I think, is really the crux, but I will show you two others that also participate in this engaño, desengaño. If you're familiar with the biblical story of Isaac and Rebekah and their twin sons, Jacob and Esau, right? The mom liked Isaac and the dad liked Esau. And so on his deathbed, he's going to give his blessing to Esau, his favorite son. And Rebecca, master of deceit, I guess my name has a deceptive history, which is very manipulative. I think this is kind of an odd thing to, as a mother myself, I can't imagine doing anything like this. But anyway, so she puts, I think it's a lamb skin on Jacob's arm to trick the father into thinking he's the hairy one and then give him his blessing. But if we think about this from an artistic perspective, that I mentioned earlier the paragone between painting and sculpture. Painting is something that tricks the eye, but sculpture is something that tricks the sense of touch. And we have the trick, the sense of touch being used to deceive you. And this is a theme in art history for centuries, that you can't trust your senses, particularly when there's art involved that's meant to deceive you. We also see this theme continued in the work in Cleveland. Again, we're going to have to go to the Old Testament to be able to understand this, but you might remember Jacob wants to marry Rachel and then gets tricked into marrying Leah, and then he works enough time for his father-in-law, and then they get to leave. And as they leave, his father-in-law is searching for his household idols. Again, if we think about sculpted idols, and this is one of the arguments against sculpture, was that sculpture was the source of idolatry, unlike painting. So in the Paragone debate, that comes up. But Rachel is hiding, his favorite wife stole the household gods. He doesn't realize this, and he swears that we didn't take them. She pretends to be menstruating, so she sits on, and it's a very odd story. She sits on the saddlebag and says, "Sorry, I can't get up," but the idols are under her. So here she's the agent of the engaño, but she's also the victim of her own deceit. If you are brushed up on your Old Testament, because her husband places a curse on whoever stole the idols, and that curse ends up falling on his wife. But I think the real key to understanding this is our own painting upstairs. Because in this painting, let's visit the story first, right? So again, this comes before this scene. This is when he's convinced his father-in-law to a deal where he'll get to keep any of the new lambs that are born that are spotted, right? But then his father-in-law tries to deceive him. There's so much deception going on in Jacob's life. You can see why he acts this way. But anyway, his father-in-law tricks him by taking out all of the spotted sheep to a different pasture so that only the white sheep will be there to mate, so Jacob has no chance of getting anything. But he decides to pull one over on his father-in-law, and he takes these rods, these peeled rods, and puts them out in front of the sheep where they're getting amorous, right? Have you noticed that upstairs before? Yeah, okay. That one, and then the one in the red room over here. There's a lot of interesting things going on at the Meadows Museum. Anyway, so by looking at these peeled rods, and I want to propose, and I don't know if you're going to buy this, but if you think about the rods almost like a paintbrush, that he's even Jacob here is able to fool nature, because they're going to be fooled into pigmenting their offspring, even though they wouldn't. I know, it might be kind of a stretch. You're like, yeah, it's a major stretch. But I think it's interesting, and there's a recent argument by my thesis advisor about the painting by Velázquez of the tunic, Joseph's tunic, the coat of many colors, where his brothers, this is again his kids, right? The deceit continues generation after generation in this family, where they pretend that his coat they put blood on it to make it look like he was devoured by wild animals because they get jealous of their brother. I'm sure you're all familiar with the story from the Zurbaran exhibition we had upstairs. But in my advisor, Felipe Paredes' argument, the tunic that they bring as evidence is supposed to represent a canvas, right? Because they've painted it. So again, paintings as agents of deception. And there's textual evidence to back that up. So it's a lot more complex than I'm making it sound. But the bottom line is, I think it's important to look at Murillo with new eyes and think about him as a very intellectually engaged and very serious artist. And one more reason I think this is compelling, you probably missed this in the first week, but the works were all 5 paintings were installed on the facade of the palace of the Marquis of Villamadrique, And they were there for the 1666 opening festivities for that reconstructed church of Santa Maria la Blanca that we've talked about a few times. But this patron, who was the patron of these works, the collector of these works, was also the protector of the Drawing Academy. And it had just been founded in 1660. And these paintings would have been painted, this date is what the Meadows gives to it, but I think more like 1665. So this is around the same time that they're thinking about their legacy as a patron, but also Murillo is thinking about his legacy as an artist. And this is a patron who would have been interested in a series of works not only that were devotional and biblically didactic, but also a meditation on what it means to be an artist and to deceive. So that's all I have for this week.